The lighthouse at Blackwater Point had stood for over a century, its light piercing through the darkest storms, guiding ships to safety. But the townsfolk of Blackwater Bay spoke in hushed tones about the old structure, claiming it was cursed. No one had lived there for decades, not since the last keeper mysteriously vanished. When Grace Harper, a young marine biologist, moved to the small coastal town for research, she was captivated by the lighthouse's eerie charm. She decided to stay in the old keeper's cottage, determined to uncover the secrets that lurked within the towering structure. But from her first night in the cottage, Grace felt something was terribly wrong. The air was thick with an unsettling presence, and the lighthouse's light seemed to flicker without reason, as if someone or something was tampering with it. As Grace settled into the cottage, she began to hear strange noises that night whispers carried on the wind, the sound of footsteps on the lighthouse stairs, and the creaking of old wooden doors. She chalked it up to the age of the building and the isolation of the place, but deep down, she knew there was more to it. One evening, while exploring the lighthouse, Grace found an old journal hidden beneath the floorboards. It belonged to the last keeper, William Harlow, who had mysteriously disappeared. The final entries were disturbing, filled with frantic scrawls about a presence in the lighthouse, something that watched him from the shadows. As she read, Grace felt a chill run down her spine. The more she read, the more she realized that Harlow's fears were not just the ramblings of a paranoid man. The presence he spoke of felt disturbingly real, and it seemed to be growing stronger. Grace's nights became increasingly restless. The once peaceful sound of waves crashing against the shore now felt like a menacing whisper. Shadows moved in the corners of her vision, always just out of sight. She started to hear a voice, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing night. It called her name, beckoning her to the lighthouse. One stormy night, Grace could no longer resist the pull. She climbed the spiral staircase of the lighthouse, each step echoing ominously in the darkness. As she reached the top, the light flickered violently, and she saw a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the room, staring out to sea. Terrified, she called out, but the figure did not move. Instead, it slowly turned toward her, revealing hollow, glowing eyes. Grace stumbled back, nearly falling down the stairs, but when she looked again, the figure was gone. The light returned to its steady glow, but Grace knew she had seen something that wasn't of this world. Determined to understand what was happening, Grace dove into the town's history. She discovered that Blackwater Point had a dark past. Dozens of ships had wrecked on its rocky shores, and many lives had been lost. The lighthouse was meant to be a beacon of safety, but instead, it seemed to attract tragedy. The townsfolk spoke of a curse, a vengeful spirit that haunted the lighthouse. They believed the spirit belonged to a woman named Eleanor, who had died in a shipwreck just off the coast. Her body was never recovered, and it was said that her restless soul had taken up residence in the lighthouse, seeking revenge on those who had failed to save her. Grace was skeptical, but the more she learned, the more the pieces began to fit together. She found old reports of lighthouse keepers driven mad, ships lured into the rocks despite the warning light, and strange occurrences that had no logical explanation. Grace was skeptical, but the more she learned, the more the pieces began to fit together. She found old reports of lighthouse keepers driven mad, ships lured into the rocks despite the warning light, and strange occurrences that had no logical explanation. One morning, she found a message scratched into the wall of the lighthouse, words that hadn't been there before. Help her. The writing was jagged and desperate, as if carved in haste. Grace's heart raced as she realized that whatever was haunting the lighthouse wasn't just malevolent, it was seeking help. But help with what? She didn't know where to start, but she knew she had to try. The voice in her dreams was growing more insistent, and the presence in the lighthouse was becoming impossible to ignore. As the days passed, Grace became obsessed with uncovering the truth. She combed through the old journal again, searching for any clues she might have missed. In one of the last entries, she found a reference to a hidden room beneath the lighthouse, a place where Harlow believed the spirit was trapped. Armed with this new information, Grace set out to find the hidden room. After hours of searching, she discovered a concealed door in the basement, hidden behind a pile of rotting wood. It led to a small, dark chamber, its walls lined with ancient, waterlogged bricks. In the center of the room, she found a small chest, locked and covered in dust. She pried it open to reveal a bundle of old, crumbling letters. As she carefully unfolded one, she realized they were written by Eleanor, the woman who had died in the shipwreck. They were love letters, filled with hope and dreams of a future that never came to pass. But one letter stood out. It was addressed to the lighthouse keeper, pleading with him to keep the light burning on the night of her arrival. The final words were smudged, but the despair was clear. "You failed me." Grace's hands trembled as she read the final letter. The lighthouse keeper had indeed failed Eleanor, but it wasn't by accident. The journal entries hinted at a darker truth. Harlow had deliberately extinguished the light on the night of Eleanor's arrival. He was in love with her, but when she chose another, his jealousy drove him to a terrible act of betrayal. Grace's breath caught in her throat as the pieces fell into place. Eleanor's spirit had been haunting the lighthouse, seeking justice for the betrayal that had cost her life. But how could Grace help her now, after all these years? Grace's breath caught in her throat as the pieces fell into place. Eleanor's spirit had been haunting the lighthouse, seeking justice for the betrayal that had cost her life. But how could Grace help her now, after all these years? Grace's breath caught in her throat as the pieces fell into place. Eleanor's spirit had been haunting the lighthouse, seeking justice for the betrayal that had cost her life. But how could Grace help her now, after all these years? "There is a way to set her free," Agnes said, her voice low and serious, "but it won't be easy. You must perform a cleansing ritual in the lighthouse, one that will release her spirit from this world. But be warned, the spirit may resist." "There is a way to set her free," Agnes said, her voice low and serious, "but it won't be easy. You must perform a cleansing ritual in the lighthouse, one that will release her spirit from this world. But be warned, the spirit may resist." She lit the candle and began to chant the words Agnes had taught her, moving through the lighthouse as she sprinkled salt and burned the sage. The air grew colder with each step, and the shadows seemed to writhe in anger. The presence was growing stronger, fighting against the ritual. As Grace reached the top of the lighthouse, the light flickered violently, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The shadowy figure appeared once more, its form more defined and menacing. The air was thick with tension, and Grace could feel the spirit's rage. But she didn't falter. She held out the letters, speaking directly to Eleanor's spirit. "You were wrong, and I'm here to make it right. You can rest now, Eleanor. You don't have to suffer anymore." The figure hesitated, its glowing eyes locked on the letters. For a moment, the air was still, and Grace thought she had succeeded. But then, with a scream that shook the lighthouse, the figure lunged at her, its icy grip closing around her throat. Grace gasped for air, her vision darkening as the spirit's rage threatened to overwhelm her. But she fought back, holding the letters closer, speaking words of comfort and release. "It's over, Eleanor. Let go." The pressure on Grace's throat suddenly eased, and she fell to the floor, gasping for breath. The figure hovered above her, its form flickering as if caught between worlds. Slowly, the anger in its eyes faded, replaced by sorrow and longing. The lighthouse filled with a soft, warm light, and for the first time, Grace saw Eleanor as she truly was, a beautiful young woman, dressed in a simple gown, her face etched with sadness. Eleanor reached out to Grace, her touch gentle and cold. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can finally rest." With those words, Eleanor's form began to dissolve, her spirit ascending into the light. The lighthouse was filled with a sense of peace, the oppressive darkness lifting as Eleanor's presence faded away. The morning after the ritual, Grace felt a sense of calm she hadn't known in weeks. The lighthouse was quiet, the air clear and fresh. The oppressive feeling was gone, and the light shone steadily, no longer flickering or dimming. The townsfolk noticed the change too. They spoke of the lighthouse with newfound respect, acknowledging the spirit that had haunted it for so long had finally been laid to rest. Grace became somewhat of a local hero, though she downplayed her role in the events. She knew the truth that Eleanor's spirit had been trapped, not out of malice, but out of a deep, unfulfilled longing. Grace was grateful she had been able to help, but she also felt a deep sadness for the young woman whose life had been cut short by betrayal. As the months passed, Grace continued her research in Blackwater Bay, but she never forgot the lighthouse or the secrets it had held. The old structure, once feared and avoided, became a beacon of hope once more, its light guiding ships safely through the treacherous waters. One evening, as she watched the sunset from the cliffs, Grace was approached by Agnes. The old woman smiled, her eyes twinkling with wisdom. "The lighthouse needs a keeper, you know," she said softly. Grace looked out at the lighthouse, its light shining steadily in the fading light. She had grown to love the old structure, despite or perhaps because of the secrets it had held. With a nod, she accepted the responsibility, knowing that the lighthouse would always be a part of her life. And so, Grace Harper became the new keeper of the lighthouse at Blackwater Point, its light guiding her as she continued her journey, a journey filled with the mysteries of the deep, the secrets of the past, and the promise of a brighter future.